Hello and welcome to the Critical Realism webinar series. I'm Paige Sweet and I'll be moderating this webinar with Professor Laura Gillman from Virginia Tech. And just a few housekeeping measures before we get started. This webinar is being recorded. Afterwards, it'll be available on the Critical Realism Network YouTube channel. And if you happen to have any difficulties during the webinar, like losing our voices or the PowerPoint, you can restart your browser and rejoin the meeting at any time. And for those of you who haven't joined us before, the presentation will be followed by a Q&A session. So to ask questions, we ask that you go to the GoToWebinar control panel on the right-hand side. You'll see a questions tab right where it's circled in red there, and you'll be able to type questions there and send them to me. And then I'll ask Laura those questions at the end of her presentation. So the title of Laura's presentation is From Identity to Non-Identity and Back Again, Towards a Feminist, Dialectical, Realist Recursivity. Laura Gillman holds a PhD in Literary Studies from the University of Wisconsin. She's been a faculty member for many years in the Women and Gender Studies programs at Virginia Tech. That program was originally located within the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies, but is currently housed in the Department of Sociology. Laura's most recent book was published in 2010 with Macmillan and is entitled Unassimilable Feminisms, Reappraising Feminist, Womanist, and Mestiza Identity Politics. Laura publishes widely on feminist and critical race theory, post-colonial studies, narrative, violence, and bridges the humanities and the social sciences in both her writing and teaching. Laura has also recently published an exciting piece in the Journal of Critical Realism, which I believe she'll be drawing on today. So thank you so much for being here with us today, Laura, to talk about this work, and I'll hand it over to you now.
Thank you so much, Paige. It's really good to be here with you today, and I'm looking forward to connecting with you and those that are tuning in on the other side of the presentation. So I'll just go ahead and get started. As I began to prepare the presentation, I considered how I might introduce the topic of feminist theory and realist theories. We could consider how feminist theory is like realist theory, their analogical relationship, such as their shared trajectory or shared critique. We might focus on the nature of the interactions or relationships between feminist theory and the different realisms, the dialogical relationship. In this approach, we might ask, do realist approaches contribute to feminist theory? Or how can feminist theory contribute to current post-positivist approaches? Are they compatible? Finally, we might address the ways in which feminists have done or could do realist work, the productive engagement of the two modes of inquiry. In this talk, I want to approach the topic a bit from each of these directions. My primary emphasis will be on how feminists have engaged realist work using my own article posted on the webinar website as an example. But I also want to flesh out a bit more the various concepts and frameworks of post-positivist realism, a sister theory to critical realism that I was only briefly able to articulate in that piece. I also broaden the discussion by taking you a bit behind the scenes, bringing into relief the existing conversational threads within feminist thought that are the source and context for post-positivist inquiry. I begin with the framing question. How are feminist thought, of which post-positivist realist inquiry forms a part, and critical realist thought similar and dissimilar? Some review of these frameworks will be necessary to respond to this question. I then highlight the range of thought that has framed feminist post-positivist inquiry. Following this introduction, I analyzed the first phase of post-positivist realism, including a discussion of its strengths and limitations. I progressed finally to a discussion of the second phase of post-positivist realism and critical realism, that of dialectical realism. Next slide. I realize that some of you may be quite familiar with critical realism, but for the sake of those that are not, a brief overview of the first phase of critical realism is in order. As a meta-theoretical project, critical realism is premised on the notion that there is a reality out there, independent of our thoughts, knowledge, and experience. It seeks to ameliorate theories that the natural and social sciences have used to explain the world. Reality, critical realists claim, cannot be apprehended by positivist approaches to knowledge and its search for law-like forms in nature and social life to establish true, timeless knowledge. Nor can it be apprehended exclusively through hermeneutics and its search for meaning and intention on the part of human subjects. Critical realists seek instead to overcome the difficulties posed by positivism, its atomistic view of events, and hermeneutics, its subject-centered idealism, which seems to preclude causation, by providing an account of what actually exists. Empiricism and interpretivism are still utilized, but in a way that shifts the understanding and practice of both. Roy Bhaskar's critical realism advocates for the pursuit of ontology within the sciences and the social sciences, the attempt to say something about the things themselves, instead of remaining focused on our beliefs, concepts, knowledge, or understanding of these things. It examines kinds, structures, processes, entities, and relationships. In this first phase, Bhaskar systematizes ontology, giving an account that is stratified into three domains: the empirical, which includes experiences of events on the part of knowing subjects; the actual, which includes events whether or not they are experienced by a knowing subject; and the real, which includes the non-observable generative mechanisms, laws, and structures that cause or produce them. Because this third domain is non-observable, knowers or agents must develop what I call a theoretical account of observed events to discover their operations. It's also called the retroductive inference. Next slide. Feminist theory is similar and dissimilar to critical realism in terms of these metaphilosophical commitments. The dissimilarities result from their respective entry points and positions into the inquiry. Critical realism emerged as a response to the crisis of positivism in the 70s and 80s. Feminist theory, defined as the academic extension of feminist movement, emerged in the context of women's lives as a response to injustice. Beginning in the 70s and 80s, feminists developed a critique of positivist science through two intersecting critical emphases, one centered on positivism as bad science, and the other on a particular subject, the woman question in science. Feminist explorations into the invisibility of women and other marginalized groups as knowers in the domain of science is the reason why the issue of bad science came up at all. A central criticism was science's portrayal of the knower or subject as generic and impartial, existing outside of the realm of the social. Feminists have long pointed out that scientists, while portraying their own inquiry as rational and arguing that the subjects of that inquiry are distinctive but not distinct, have nonetheless produced a science of difference and inequality by excluding critical writings by women and other marginalized groups. The modes of thinking used in science to legitimate knowledge or progress are male, Western projects, both historically and ideologically, and often benefit that group. Science has not been about the discovery of race and gender, feminist philosophers of science have argued, as much as it has been about being complicit with ideologies of race, class, and gender, aiding in the construction of these categories under the guise of value neutrality. These questions have led to a reevaluation of the notion of scientific objectivity. Feminist post-empiricists Nancy Tuana and Lynn Hankinson Nelson have pointed out that our observation statements are not value-free. Our physical object ontology is undergirded by unacknowledged theory. Even a desk, they affirm, is a theoretical concept. To remedy this under-acknowledgement, feminist empiricists have, since the 80s, asked for a paradigm shift from the view from nowhere, the God trick that positivism performs, to one that embraces situated rationality. In science, this concept entails a knowledge production process that is inclusive of an ever-widening circle of embodied knowers whose experiences are located and contextualized. So the idea here is that inclusiveness will embed democratic values in science. Sandra Harding's standpoint epistemology engages the conceptualization of situated rationality, raising the woman question in science and notions of scientific rationality and objectivity to a whole new level. I want to take a bit of time here to review standpoint epistemology. First, because it is generally recognized as an early bridge between critical realism and feminist theory. From 1999 to 2003, there were several published exchanges between critical realist Tony Lawson and Sandra Harding that included comments and critiques as well from three other notable feminist theorists. I will discuss the exchanges more a bit later on in the presentation. Secondly, standpoint epistemology is relevant because it was subsequently integrated into post-positivist realism. So, standpoint epistemology begins with the claim that the methods of positivist science will not lead to objectivity because they focus on the context of justification, that is, the verification processes that occur in the final phases of research, while excluding from examination the context of discovery or the social context of the researcher. It is in this latter context that difficult to detect cultural-wide assumptions find their way into the research design. By not including the context of discovery in the inquiry, Harding states, the interests, values, and social causes of that largely white male group are not only masked, but passed off as universal. This is to say that no contrary assumptions are present to bring their assumptions and interests into visibility. Harding begins by advocating situated knowledge. In a race, gendered, classed, and Western-centric society, she states, we must have a method in which the activities and perspectives of those at the bottom of the social hierarchy can provide starting points for more reliable thought, since they can provide the relief or contrast necessary to detect invisible background beliefs, assumptions, and values driving scientific research. Thought generated by this method would lead to a stronger objectivity, because those impacted by intersecting systems of power relations will have causal and critical questions about the way the social order works and science's role in maintaining that order. But Harding goes further to suggest how situated knowledge becomes a standpoint or objective knowledge about the world. Causal questions arising from embodied sensory experience can become developed into a theory and corroborated when the individual weighs her experiences against other empirical data, including experiences of other members of the same racial, ethnic, and gendered group. In doing so, certain patterns in social processes, entities, and relations, including scientific processes, emerge that otherwise would not have been detected or observed. This move to perspectival objectivity grew out of an ethical imperative, the ought to in feminist thought, to pursue greater justice through pursuing a greater truth. As Jennifer Tannock Bland argues in her review of standpoint epistemology, science's processes and content have always included not only the metaphysical and the methodological, but also the moral. It was only later in the development of science, in the mid-19th century, that aperspectivalism appeared and the absenting of value specificity along with it. Tannock Bland makes the point here that even though Harding does affect a sort of return to the earlier approach of perspectivalism, reaffirming the fact-value connection, this does not diminish the strong empiricist realist core within standpoint epistemology. There is, as Harding shows, an ontological significance to objectivity. To review then, standpoint epistemology is realist. Knowledge about the world is located and theory dependent. The real includes the actual, what occurs to people, the empirical, what occurs to other people in the world, and the real, the prior to, as well as the unobserved generative mechanisms, that is the social structures and processes of which knowers form a part, that lead to causal questions and potentially to a grounded standpoint. In the published exchanges between Sandra Harding and critical realist Tony Lawson, that also included Drusilla Barker, Julie Nelson, and Fabienne Peter, the goal of the feminist theorists was to show that critical realism was not epistemological enough. Lawson's goal was to contribute to feminist theory by positing the ontological concept of contrastive explanation, because he thought that Harding had not been ontological enough. Contrastive explanation is an ontological explanation about the nature of being. It is the idea that deviations or contrasts are events that occur with regularity in the natural and social world. By identifying unknown causal mechanisms that result in surprising deviations or contrasts between groups and their positionings, Lawson affirmed, we can better justify a standpoint. I realize that my review of this debate is quite brief, but I hope to have said enough to illustrate the important differences between feminism and critical realism, as illustrated by this exchange. In feminist theory, ontology has always been linked to or constellated with epistemology, values, and interests, given its normative commitments to correct injustice. In terms of standpoint epistemology, the injustice that Harding wanted to highlight was the invisibility of women's knowledge, which is why she focused on correcting epistemic standards rather than developing a full-blown social ontology. But there's another reason why Harding wouldn't go in that direction. In feminist theory, the concept of situated knowledge refers not just to the classification of social positions and their reproduction and transformation vis-a-vis the social structure, but also and principally to the researcher's position within specific historical relations. Harding reminds us that, and I quote, economics or science theorists, ontologists, and epistemologists occupy social structural positions as intensely as anyone else, end of quote. And, quote, what we or any other historical group takes to be the basic ontology of reality is itself located in the social structure of our time and place, end of quote. Next slide. Let me go further now into the researcher's structural position vis-a-vis the feminist and critical realist ontological project. In my article, I suggested, following Margaret Shildrick and Janet Price, that while there is a rich repository of work on the extra-discursive dimensions of the body in feminist thought, ontology has been problematized. This was, I suggested, a reactionary response to modernist discourses that produced racial and gender difference, namely men as minds and women and people of color as bodies, and so on. In response to modernist discourses, feminists have tended to view bodies not as ontological entities, but as effects of discourse. Discussions on the fraught relationship between feminist theory and ontology are quite broad in scope and are covered under the area of feminist metaphysics. Metaphysics is the broader umbrella term for the philosophical study of reality and being, while ontology is a branch of metaphysics focusing on the basic categories of being and their relations. But actually in the practice, often these two terms are used interchangeably. Metaphysics and philosophy considers such concepts as identity, causation, essence, substance, and kind. In this terrain, feminists have provided similar critiques to the ones I referenced earlier with regards to science. Feminist philosophers Charlotte Witt and Sally Haslinger, for example, have noted that classificatory schemes in metaphysics may, more than mapping individuals and groups, exercise the power to both establish and reinforce groupings which may eventually come to fit the classifications or kinds we have set up, naturalizing categories that were non-substantive ones. Nonetheless, feminist metaphysics has developed, albeit in conjunction with feminist ethics and social justice concerns in mind. It has evolved in two directions. First, feminist metaphysics is found in the subject matter, mapping out of sexism, the nature of gender, and the questions of identities and essence. The second approach to feminist metaphysics is found in its perspective or orientation. Here, what makes metaphysics feminist is a different approach to metaphysical questions. The approach might include the use of new metaphors, images, or methods. Simone de Beauvoir, in her classic text, The Second Sex, does both. Her topic is how one becomes gendered as a woman, and her method of approaching the topic is new. She writes as a woman. She puts herself in the ontology. This is quite different from traditional metaphysics, where the ontologist remains outside of the ontology, or at least seemingly so. These two approaches tend to be integrated in feminist theory, both inside and outside of the field of philosophy. The examination of identities within feminist metaphysics, for example, is a topic within a long-standing debate between realists, those who believe that the names we give to things correlate with real objects in the world, and nominalists, those who believe that the names we give to things do not represent existing objects. But identities are also examined as real identities by feminist theorists and minority scholars across a variety of disciplines, which is where I and many others have entered the conversation. Indeed, these disciplinary and interdisciplinary terrains at a certain point, the late 90s, converged, giving rise to postpositivist realism, a philosophy linked to humanities fields and feminist and critical race theory. Next slide. The debate over identities and identity politics has perhaps been one of the most enduring within feminist thought, with one pole advocating for the retention of identities as a basis for feminist politics, the constructivists, and the other pole viewing identities as obsolete and counterproductive, power latent and coercive, the postmodernists. Through the course of the 90s, there developed a wariness to deal with the complexities that arise when invoking difference, the problem at the heart of the debates. At the same time, postmodernist discourses had taken hold within feminist thought, shedding light on the ways in which differences among women had proliferated to the extent that woman, as a category, could not hold. I think it would be safe to say that the latter pole won out. Yet minority scholars continued to argue that by not attending to the theoretical possibilities of reformulating identities, the agenda for social justice would be co-opted from within and from without. It was within this context that a consortium of scholars of color and institutions formed a sort of think tank called the Future of Minority Studies in the late 90s, spearheaded by post-colonial literary scholar Satya Mohanty and feminist scholars such as Janella Butler, Beverly Guy-Sheftall, and Linda Martine Alcoff, among many others. In their publications and colloquia, they developed and disseminated a post-positivist realism by merging standpoint theory with some concepts from American pragmatism and analytical philosophy. The goal here was to use post-positivist realism to legitimate identities as real identities, as sources of social knowledge, and as sites from which it is possible to seek a radical renewal of a democratic society. A post-positivist realist approach to identities offered an alternative to the skeptical stance of postmodernism that in its extreme iteration denies that we can use language and concepts altogether as a resource to know the world, as well as to the positivist position that recognizes knowledge as only that which is self-evident. It shares a family resemblance with critical realism. Its basic premise is that the social and natural world exist independently of our knowledge of it. Post-positivist realism does not take identities to be fixed and essentialized, but rather linked to organic beings that exist extra-discursively, and like all organic beings existing in the natural world, are subject to change. By using their identities as sources of knowledge, members of marginalized communities can reveal the non-observable mechanisms that generate events and identities, as well as use their identity as a site for individual and collective agency. Many post-positivist realists, including myself, trace these processes within literary texts authored by minority writers. Texts are fictional, but this does not mean that they cannot tell us about how the social world operates. Characters and their actions within their circumstances are invested with constituents, elementary beliefs or premises about human plights. And when these do not cohere into a way of life in some way that we expect them to, for example, the achievement of personhood, but rather are violated, well, that's when the story begins. So in this slide, I'm trying to show the process. I represent the process with a gear concept. You can see the larger motor, the big gear, the unobserved generative mechanisms and social structures that produce events. People are not just out there in some abstract way, as you see in the image on the left, but depending on their identities, are located vis-a-vis those events. Those at the bottom of the hierarchy will have different experiences of those events than those at the top, which in turn will prompt that group to generate an explanation or theory that can make sense of their experiences. A reclaiming of identity in turn can lead to acts that can influence change in the social structure. Next slide. Let me delve a bit deeper now into the real nature of identities. Identities are fundamental to who we are because they have causal determinacy over our epistemic and political orientations to the world. That is what we care about, what we notice, as well as how we are seen or interacted with. We can think of social identities as having two features, the public identity and the lived one. The public one is the socially perceived self within systems of perception and classification, while the lived one is how one perceives oneself. In our current society, because of racism and sexism, the public identity of women and racial ethnic minorities is often a flattened one. It isn't real, although it operates as if it were. As Linda Martine Alcoff notes, public identity is tied to social structure. It's predetermined. It's almost as if it were here before we got here. While lived identity or lived subjectivity is how we experience ourselves. It is indexed to locations in which experiences and perceptions occur and from which an individual potentially acts. These public and lived identities are not always perfectly mapped onto one another. The interplay between the two, however, is constant and even mutually constitutive. The task at hand in the post-positivist realist project is to examine their mutual constitution to determine the causal mechanisms generating the public identity and avoid the kinds of confusions that result from the impact of ideology and false consciousness. Consider the weird kinds of reflections one might have when buying into the idea that we can separate out these identities. So for an example, we can look at how women understand themselves within the context of the hashtag #MeToo movement. We might have the typical reactions towards sexual objectification like, why am I being perceived or defined as a body object to be possessed? I am not my body. I'm more than that, or I'm something else than that. I am what I think I am with my mind. Rather than maintain the binaries Alkoff suggests, the project here is to illuminate the experiences of oneself, as well as to critique the traditional binary descriptions, mind, body, or interior, exterior, using somatic sensorial experience, as well as engagement with the empirical world as a form of corroboration. Consider the example I gave in the article of postpositivist realist scholar Paula Moya, who illustrates the postpositivist realist reclaiming of identities through a personal story. She explains that she thought of herself as Spanish until she went to Yale. Then, in meeting students there who identified as Chicana, she was able to use her location, her own previous somatic experiences, as a source of reflection on her internalization of a false post-colonial identity, and reorganize her identity in a manner that would serve individual and group interests. Here is where we see the influence and integration of standpoint epistemology. Let me now turn to a metaphor in postpositivist realism drawn from Hans-Georg Gadamer's hermeneutics, that of the interpretive horizon. Gadamer's hermeneutics is useful in terms of helping us get closer to the real, to what we would call an ontology of the self, by tracking the knower's processes in gaining access to the causal mechanisms generating identities and understanding. As I previously stated, identities correlate to often surprising patterned experiences that serve as starting off points from which we become interested in understanding. But to discern meaning from our experiences, we need to develop an interpretation. Hermeneutics attaches analytical value to the interpreter's background and perspective as resources. This is because achieving understanding requires the knower to use personal experience to make sense of things. Personal experience gives rise to our prejudgments, which have been formed from a wide range of prior experiences, direct or indirect. This reflective, situated rationality includes the capacity to doubt where there is reason to. One doubts, for example, what one is told, where there is a discrepancy with one's experience. All of this is to say that we are not standing outside of a historical context as knowers, or what Gadamer calls a tradition. We are in the tradition. Drawing from Gadamer, Alkoff defines the horizon as, quote, the range of vision that includes everything that can be seen from a particular vantage point, end of quote. Here, the horizon is a substantive, ontological, perspectival location from which the interpreter looks out at the world as it is, open and dynamic. The concept of horizon allows us to grasp the background assumptions we bring with us to perception and understanding, as well as the concepts and categories of description that constitute the conceptual repository of that tradition. It is therefore useful in illuminating cultural or group-related and personal differences that affect interpretation, including identity concepts, categories, and classifications. The metaphor of horizon offers a reconstructed hermeneutics. It links experience and identity, public and lived, as constitutive features for understanding. If you look at the slide, you might guess that the horizon is represented with the concept image of the funnel. A funnel represents the social world as process. As individuals and members of social groups, we are going through the social processes, gaining knowledge because we are engaged with and reacting to them. Located somatic experiences are more than starting off points for knowledge, as in standpoint. They are, as Alkoff affirms, perceptual access points from which the causal aspects of reality become visible. Next slide. I now want to move on to dialectical realism, the second phase of postpositivist realism. Let me state just as a caveat that I'm the person calling it the second phase of postpositivist realism. I haven't heard anybody else do that. It might be a wish fulfillment or something of that nature, but there's a reason behind it. It's because it reflects a further development in Linda Martina Alcoff's realist frameworks. So she's really the continuity between what I'm calling these two phases. I hope to have shown in my discussion of the first phase that theory-mediated knowledge was not motivated by the goal of epistemic mastery, but instead at illuminating a tradition through one's somatic perceptual access to the world by being in it. In this regard, postpositivist realism was always ontologically oriented. Still, retrospectively, we might acknowledge that postpositivist realism needed to go further, that perhaps what I'm calling the first phase was too subject-centered, too imbued with an idealism. To get closer to the real, it would be necessary to become more object-centered. On the other end of the spectrum, critical realist ontology in its first phase might have reflected a stronger and more dynamic connection to epistemology. Let me begin this discussion by way of a brief overview of Bhaskar's dialectical critical realism, and then move forward to explain Adorno's dialectical realism as put forth by Linda Martina Alcoff and Alireza Shamali. Bhaskar's dialectical critical realism is a big leap forward in its capacity to make claims about reality. It acknowledges the importance of, but does not enthrone, the human subject. Instead, it highlights the constellation of thought and reality, subject and object, as well as opens up the ontology more fully to processes of change and becoming. This is a point that I really wanted to emphasize in this presentation. The dynamic nature of the world and our knowledge of it that is brought out so well when ontology is wed to dialectics. Bhaskar defines the dialectic as a sort of structure in process by virtue of the interconnections, contradictions, and oppositions which bring about the elaboration and transformation of a given system. It is encompassed by four phases: non-identity, negativity, totality, and ethical agency. Non-identity highlights real difference existing in the world, an assertion that highlights the preeminence of ontology over epistemology. Difference includes the different natural kinds of things existing in the world, which encompasses stratification and differentiation. Real negation is constituted by Bhaskar's concept of real absence. Absence comes into play where an entity ceases to exist or is encountered somewhere else. In her profoundly post-positivist rendering of the law, in her work, The Alchemy of Race and Rights, critical race theorist Patricia Williams provides an example of the absenting of race, its conversion into a real phantom. She uses the metaphor of an empty bedroom, which I have tried to reproduce in the upper right quadrant of the slide to describe the current status of racism. Despite the bed no longer being there, out of habit, you're still aware of it and walk around the once filled room. Despite racism not being as obvious, however, it has not been eliminated. The emptiness of the room reflects the emptiness of formal equality. It is a form of real omission or absence, which in turn triggered affirmative action, a form of expression. So what I'm trying to say here or show here is that both identity, non-identity, and absence or real negativity allow for the triggering of the world's dynamic and processual quality as well as causality. Totality comes into play next with the notion of constellation, the idea that different layers of being are linked, such as epistemology and ontology, since knowing is a subset of being and ontology is epistemically committed. Put differently, totality is driven by inherent change, conflict, and contradictions rooted in the material world, the site where human activity, including the ideas generated by humans about the world, can also react back onto and in turn transform the material underpinnings of society. Finally, ethical agency is the fourth dimension. For Bhaskar, ethical agency is about creating a society where human flourishing is possible, one in which moral freedom is individually, collectively, and universally achieved. We could continue to use Patricia Williams' example of the empty bedroom to understand these last two layers, just by asking the questions, what does it mean to realize, know, care, or understand through somatic experiences the real disjunctures between formal and substantive inequality? How ought one to respond? Next slide. In what remains of my presentation, I want to focus on Theodor Adorno's negative dialectics. There are clearly striking overlaps with the four layers of Bhaskar's dialectical realism. There might just be one of the layers that I think that they would be at loggerheads about, and that would be the one relating to totality, and we could talk about that in the question and answer later if there's interest. It is interesting to note that Alcoff and Shamali initiated the dialectical turn in postpositivist realism with their 2010 article, Adorno's Dialectical Realism, just 6 years after Alan Norrie published his article, Bhaskar, Adorno, and the Dialectics of Modern Freedom. Adorno's dialectical realism serves as a corrective to the first phase of postpositivist realism, insofar as it validates the ontological primacy of the object. The ontological primacy given to the object does not mean that the object takes the place of the subject, that is, that it's enthroned or becomes a demigod, right? It means simply that material reality is the first moment in the dialectic of being and thought. To put it differently, it is not our thinking or subjective acts that push the dialectic forward, enacting negation or resistance against the world as it is, but something that follows from the dynamic nature of the object itself, its materiality. As human subjects, we are always after the task of pursuing the object, but because the object is in the world moving through it, undergoing mediations of the subjects that encounter it, as well as its own mediations, it cannot be curtailed by our previous or current concepts, classifications, or categories. Next slide. Adorno uses the concept of constellation to capture the moment in which the concept and object, things in the world, including people, do not correlate. That is, it's the moment of non-identity. In a constellation, the mediations of an object, which I attempt to capture in the slide with the circular shape surrounding the object, will reverberate around it, forming a sort of constellation. The idea here is that when we encounter the object again, it is a new one. It isn't new because it is now the sum total of its subjectively derived mediations, because that would lead us right back to identity thinking, which Adorno defines as the subsuming of particulars under general concepts or grand narratives. Instead, what Adorno is suggesting with the constellation is that the object is always ahead of the concept and in contradiction with it. By tracking the object through the various mediations constituting the constellation, the knower gains access to a constellation of concepts. This can result in a deeper and more complex engagement with the object as it becomes differentiated from what it was in the process of assessing its relations with things according to the criteria it has of itself. The wedding of ontology to dialectics gets us closer to the thing itself, helps the knower avoid reification of thought, and allows for human agency. What I tried to contribute to dialectical realism in my article was an integration of negative dialectics and feminist theory, indicating the former's utility for feminist problems and concerns. In the article posted, I provided a case study on the identity of the third world worker within late capitalist processes, constructed as poor brown women. I compared the explanatory power of the original postpositivist realist approach to identity using Chandra Talpady Mohanty's analysis of the third world worker from her 2003 book, Feminism Without Borders, with the feminist dialectical realist approach using Alicia Schmidt Camacho's analysis of the third world worker from her 2008 work, Migrant Imaginaries, Latino Cultural Politics in the US-Mexico Borderlands. In contrast to the postpositivist realist approach used by Talpady Mohanty, where the identity concept of the third world worker is preserved as a political category and is portrayed as fully able to correlate with or identify with the object, the third world worker, Schmidt Camacho's text captures that moment of the emergence of the object in the particular historical moment of non-identity, a moment that is initiated by the object being in the world within late capitalist structures. In her text, it is also revealed how thought and being become constellated in the life of the circuit worker interviewee, opening up the possibility for change and becoming. In showing to the interviewers the deeply wounding calluses on her fingers, stretching the length of both her forefingers to her wrists as a result of her labor, the 22-year-old circuit worker contributed to an ontology of the self in interaction with the non-observable mechanisms of capitalist structures. Reality had imposed itself on her with resistance against concepts and categories established by stakeholders in the assembly plant operations. These social actors had constructed the concept or category of the ideal third world worker as poor brown women through the descriptors watchful eyes and nimble fingers. while the identity concept of the third world worker enabled economically exploitative practices and was further legitimized by racial capitalist and patriarchal ideologies, the worker interviewee lets the interviewers know that it is not real. The sensuous materiality of the experience of the object remains otherwise than the subject's projection, revealing something beyond the concept, reality itself. The calluses make visible the non-observable causal structures of capitalism defining the woman's identity instrumentally, leading to her pain and suffering, and to the suffering of the other workers she references. It is through her somatic experiences that the interviewee gains consciousness and the possibilities for freedom are opened up. Next slide. Okay. So I end this presentation by considering the implications of negative dialectics for future ontological work. I want to suggest that we are faced not just with an ethical, but also with a categorical imperative. It seems to me that as theorists and researchers, our challenge is to use our examination of objects in the world to transform the categories and concepts we use to analyze them. This is what I'm calling recursivity. As you can see in the slide, it involves returning to and renovating our concepts and classifications, curtailed by thought and methodology, to fit the changed object. Thus, the title of this presentation, Identity to Non-Identity and Back Again. So I'm not suggesting that we should get rid of identity so much as that we should change the concepts that we use to think about identity. In reconceptualizing, we critically engage philosophical, social, and scientific knowledge, acknowledging their embeddedness in ideology. Recursivity allows us the freedom to release ourselves from what Adorno calls the death mask we have turned reality into with our reified representations and classifications, so that we can hold our social and philosophical projects, reasoning processes, and methods up to reality. Recursivity also helps us to acknowledge that our thought processes are not separated off from reality. This reconstructed metaphysics reflects and acknowledges its merger with ethics. Adorno was a post-Auschwitz philosopher. He believed that to avoid the repetition of history with its suffering and unfreedom, we must not let thought be entrapped in idealisms or denials. His dialectics creates an opening for the possibility of change without denying thought its full potential, the contribution of human beings in the world. But change also disrupts the primacy of philosophical inquiry. Truth can no longer be seen as derived from some abstract correspondence between thought and reality, proposition and fact. Instead, truth is derived from thought in practice. This is to say that philosophy is dependent upon the social world. There ought to be, according to Adorno, an interdependence of philosophy and sociology. So he kind of advocates for sort of interdisciplinarity. I would add that feminism needs to be thrown in as well because into this merger, because I think it does reflect the type of interdisciplinary merger that he had in mind. So I stop here. Thank you.
So thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. I think you've given us a lot to think about, a way to think about epistemology, inequality, embodiment in this very serious way while remaining committed to this, to realist social explanation. And I think that sort of merger is really important for critical realism to take seriously. So thank you for that. So I want to remind people that they can ask questions through the tab on the right-hand side of the control panel, and I'll go ahead and read those to Laura as they come in. But just as a way to sort of get us started, I have a lot of questions myself, and so maybe I'll just start with one or two of those, and then we can move on to audience questions. So this goes back to the sort of the beginning of your presentation, Laura. And in your paper, you talk about some, I think you call it ontological anxiety in feminist theory, which I think is a great way to put it, in part because of concern for essentializing racial and sexual differences or naturalizing bodies. But I think you make the case using critical realism for thinking about ontology a little bit differently in feminist theory. And I wonder if you can just talk a little bit more informally about your sort of approach to ontology and the role that you think it should play in feminist theory going forward.
Well, I think that ontology contextualized within, ontological realism, I think it already has been used, not a whole lot. Like, for example, because it hasn't been systematized in any way. And that's where it kind of gives the appearance that it isn't being used. So like Patricia Williams, and I think a lot of the intersectionality theory is very ontologically oriented. But I wanna think through like a couple like broader approaches to ontology and the way it's used in feminist theory. So one approach would be to use it in a way that kind of fits within what already exists in terms of methodology. And I'm thinking, for example, of Leslie McCall's article, is a 2005 article called The Complexity of Intersectionality. And she actually makes reference to Boscar's critical realism, and she uses it as a kind of justification for her particular approach to intersectionality, which she calls categorical intersectionality. Now, just as a background note for those that aren't really attuned to feminist theory, intersectionality was a theory that grew out of the experiences of women of color, particularly Black women, to begin with. And one of the major theorists of that group was Kimberly Crenshaw, who was a legal studies scholar. And she came up with this term intersectionality in her work, in her article, Demarginalizing the Margins, to kind of describe an ontological position that Black women find themselves in, which is that within legal institutions and social and cultural ones as well, Black women's interests, Black women's rights are always subordinated to the rights and the interests when it's around race, when it's inequality around race to Black men, and when it's around inequality in terms of gender, subordinated to the interests of white women. So that seems to me to be a profoundly postpositivist insight. And it speaks to some of the non-observed mechanisms that exist in the social structure, namely that the way power works within each one of the categories to default to the highest or the most powerful category in that group: white women within the group of women, Black men within the group of Black people. And so she was trying to develop, along with other Black feminists, a different kind of category for Black women, because their experiences didn't fit very neatly into the category women or men or being raised as Black, right? And so she gives the example of the metaphor of an intersection, right? When a car is in an intersection and gets into a collision, depending on where it is in the intersection, it's going to be damaged in a particular way. And so what she's trying to say with this is that you can't really separate out race, class, gender. They're always functioning, right? Very interactively, right? And so that to me is an example of recursivity, right? It's taking an experience, right, of a category and then remapping it in a way that actually makes more sense, right? And so what happens in this article, though, is that Leslie McCall is kind of concerned with how do you do post-positivist work, or how do you take intersectionality, which is a theory, and make it work within a methodology. And I think that's pretty tricky business, right? And you can't. It's not easy to do within like quantitative and those kind of traditional methodologies. So she came up with another category, right? I mean, she talked about two other categories. One was the anti-categorical approach, which is just postmodernist, which she kind of dispensed with almost immediately. And then she came up with her own category, which was the categorical approach, which she says that basically what she's going to do is to retain that category of women, right? And then she's just going to make it proliferate more within the surveys that she uses. So that I mean, that to me is, I think it lacks in the critical part of critical realism. I think that she came up with a lot of interesting insights about how inequality works in different sites, right, in different regions, but I don't think she got to the real in the way I understand it from an ontological perspective, right? Then quite differently, I think you find feminist philosophers working in metaphysics doing some really interesting things. So for example, I mean, we see that gender has proliferated, right? So much so that how can we talk about, how can we talk about women, as I tried to suggest in the presentation, in a way that can benefit our politics? And so Elise Witt, Charlotte Witt comes up with this idea of, she deals with the problem of essence, and she looks at two kinds of essentialism. One that we're more familiar with, which is kind essentialism, where all members of a particular kind share the same properties. And she says that just didn't work when applied to women. But then she looks at another type of essentialism that she calls uni-essentialism, which comes from Aristotle. And she argues pretty convincingly that this would work, although she doesn't know to what extent it would benefit feminist theory, because it doesn't really benefit the entire group or speak to shared properties of an entire group. But uni-essentialism, she wanted to come up with this idea because she said that so many people that she spoke to said that gender mattered in really significant ways to who they were, right? And that if you took that away, or if you tried to change their gender, then they would be completely different. And so uni-essentialism is this idea that it only applies to individual social identities, right? That she gives the example of a house. Like, what is a house composed of? Is it composed of house particles and parts, or is there something that essentially, like a heap of different things, or is there something that kind of brings it together and make it cohere into a whole? And she says that, yeah, there is something, it's their functionality, right? She doesn't go on to say what it is, but the function of, maybe shielding, protecting from the elements, that sort of thing. And in the case of the social identity of women or men, she says that she asked the same question, is there something that holds the category together of the individual? And she says that organizes it, right? And that determines ahead of time the types of roles and the complex practices that and expectations associated with that role. And she says, yes, there is, and it's gender. So there's something constitutive from a uni-essentialist perspective of gender for the individual. So obviously we're not thinking in individualistic frameworks, right? That would kind of be counter to the feminist project, right? But it's a starting point, right? It's not, but it starts from actually it's object driven, right? And that's what to me is appealing about it. It's like looking, okay, this is what's happened after the proliferation of difference. Now what do we do now that we observe this, right? And then Maria Lugones, another feminist philosopher, she comes up with another concept which is interesting. She asks if substance should be a basis for kind, and she wants to re-examine that, because she says if substance is necessarily linked and serves as the basis for kind, then we can't look outside of the boundaries and of kinds, and it limits the amount of categories that we can actually have. So she takes the example of a horse, and she says, like, there's no middle ground for kind if we think of it in terms of substance. If you're either a horse or you're not a horse, right? There's nothing in the middle. And that's different from other binaries, like where you have short and tall, and in the middle you have medium height, and so forth and so on, right? So there's a limitation of categories. And so if you take man and you say, well, man is a kind substantively, well, then either you're a man or you're not a man. And so she says the only way to pick out a female is to say, well, that it's by looking at the substance of mankind, and that it kind of operates in society as being the opposite. but that obfuscates or limits all the other categories. So she says a better approach would be to try to look at everything that's in between, mixed categories. So and the more we do that, the more we can kind of loosen the stranglehold of substantival assumptions in relation to kind. And so she talks about intersex beings or asex beings and so forth and so on. So that kind of approach, again, it's more object driven in terms of ontology, and I think it's much more effective looking first at what is actually happening, right, and then trying to remap our concepts, our metaphysical concepts.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful, and it resonates with some of the examples you gave of starting with sort of marginalized bodily experiences. And using, that have to cross back and forth between sort of ideology and lived experience, and using that as sort of an access point. Which I think leads me to another question, which is about feminist standpoint theory. So you gave a really nice overview of feminist standpoint theory, and you talked, I think you gave us an understanding of standpoints really as sort of structural access points, but not end points in the sort of production of objective social knowledge, which I think is really helpful. So I guess I'm wondering what you see as the sort of in-between thing there is between sort of standpoint as a structural access point, and then how to produce objective social knowledge from that place. Is it through community? Is it through politics? Is it through science? I think maybe as critical realism would have it. So I'm wondering how you see that sort of mechanism working from standpoint to knowledge production.
Well, I think that, lately I'm thinking a lot through an Adornian lens, right? I think that I would be leery of any kind of long-term scientific, right, way of thinking about objectivity, right? I think that we have, everything's historicized, right? And so Adorno's Constellation, I think, is a really, really powerful construct in terms of thinking about the way we do it. It's this constant, right, interplay between the object and the concept, which I think is what standpoint is as well, right? It's always the doubt, well, no, this isn't my experience, right? That's where knowledge comes from, but knowledge is always superseded, right? And I'm not saying that the change is like really accelerated and really happening fast, right? But I think that there's a way in which within the domains that we work in, right, that knowledge and objectivity around our objects gets reified. And so I would rather, that's why we constantly need to be reworking our theories. And standpoint epistemology is kind of a case in point, because there were certain impasses, right, with standpoint epistemology. Like, let's say maybe 20 years ago, people are just like threw their hands up. They're like, oh no, we can't do this. At a certain point, you didn't hear anything about standpoint epistemology. I mean, I have colleagues that didn't even want, colleagues of color, they didn't even want to use that terminology. And I think intersectionality started to kind of take its place. So I think it may be making a comeback. But there was something that seemed to be, there was a perception, right, of around power, right? That how was it that people that were in disadvantaged structural positions were able to be the ones that know, right? And that was seen as having more, more capital in some way within feminist thought, which is really absurd, right? So there's a really interesting exchange in the Standpoint Theory Reader, which was published in 2004, between Susan Heckman, who's a political scientist, and Patricia Collins, Dorothy Smith, and Sandra Harding. And basically, it kind of emblematizes this problem, because Susan Heckman was making the point that in her article that standpoint theory is passé. We can't really do anything with it because we have all these different standpoints, right? And what are we going to do with all of them? Who gets to be right? And who gets to decide who's going to be right, right? It's kind of the problem, you know, the critical realist problem, right, of epistemic relativism and judgmental rationality, but kind of in a pretty absurd, it seems, setting. Sandra Harding comes back and says, you know, this isn't a matter of being like a multicultural administrator here, right? It's that's a misunderstanding of what standpoint is. And it gets back to what you said about questions, right? It's when you're located in a position that would cause you to have doubt or better knowledge about the social structure because of the way it's because of the way power relations are impacting you, right? Or social events are impacting you, then you're going to be able to respond to that in ways that people that are located differently aren't going to be able. But it's perceived as power, right? As epistemic power. So yeah, I think those are unfortunate exchanges, but they happen even within feminist theory.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think your reading of standpoint theory, especially drawing so much on Harding, really gives us a way to stay committed to the sort of realist, sort of power-centric core of standpoint theory in a way that doesn't allow us to descend into that sort of relativistic critique of standpoint theory. So I really appreciated that. So I wanted to ask, at the end of your paper, and a little bit also at the end of the talk, you give some really illuminating examples. So from Camacho's work on circuit workers at the US-Mexico border, and then you mentioned Chandra Mohanty's work in her text, Feminism Without Borders, as part of your case study. I wondered if you could talk, because I think it's really helpful to hear these kinds of examples. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the example that you used from Chandra Mohanty.
Yeah, well, Chandra Mohanty's approach is, you know, I was trying to really kind of pull together two theorists that were working on exactly the same problem, but coming, and both from a post-positivist perspective, but that were very different. One more emblematizing the first phase, which is more subject-driven in its dialectics, and the other, the Schmidt-Camacho one, that was more object-driven and more emblematizing the second phase. So Chandra Mohanty, she retains the category of the ideal third world worker. And just as a background explanation, I'm sure the listeners will be familiar with this ground, but just in case, starting from the 60s and into the 80s, the global financial institutions like the IMF and others started to encourage ruling elites from developing nations to ramp up their production of foreign financed industrial goods. And so they started building these industrial zones like the ones that we find along the US-Mexico border, and they created assembly plants and so on. And the idea was that they could start paying back their debt, right, to first world nations. So, you know, you might think that, well, okay, this is great. You know, here we have this pact between an all-male group. You've got the CEOs and in the home and host nations and these global institutions. All they need is basically a workforce, right? A cheap labor force. And so they start to recruit young women, young brown women from these countries, often rural women. In the case of Mexico, they were women that came from the south up to the north in a very destabilized economy. And so Mohanty makes the point that there was kind of an ideological overlay onto this practice that was meant to legitimize targeting the recruiting of this particular segment of the population. And it was the kind of naturalizing of women's work, so that the work that they did in the factories with their, you know, the very fine work with the circuits and the, you know, for television and that sort of thing, was very similar to the work they did in the home, right? Sewing, fine lace work. And she gives the example even of the lace makers of Narsapur who actually worked in the home, right? And so their work was cast either as homework or as non-work, and their identities were cast as non-workers. And so Chandotapali Mohanty recognizes that retaining the category is problematic, but at the same time, she chooses to do it because what she wants to do is conscientize these women workers as workers. And so working within some justice organizations that did coalitions across a number of transnational sites, she says in this piece that women were conscientized as workers, that they were able to reach, and they started to defend their rights and ask for better working conditions and so forth and so on. So even though it was subject driven, I think it still was able to get to the real, and it was still able to meet with change, right? And then on the other side, where the dialectic I hope I showed was more object driven, there also were successes, because even though we have this interviewee with the calloused hands saying that, you know, most of the other women that she worked with had already left and she was going to leave as well, we don't know if they got better jobs anywhere else. But what we do know is that starting from the mid-90s, they started putting signs up in these maquiladoras saying that we're looking for men to hire as well as women. So there was a loosening, right, of the kind of correlation between this real object and the ideal third world worker.
Yeah, those are such helpful examples. And I think your example of the calloused hands was so helpful for demonstrating this the sort of role of the body in feminist thought as sort of illuminating, being at the stubborn site of social inscription that can illuminate these sort of broader structures. And I think your example really illustrates that beautifully in a way that I think critical realism can learn from, really, as an analytic strategy. I wondered also if you could talk about, so you mentioned the dialectical realism at the end of your answer just then, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit about some of its, you sort of were getting here with your example of Leslie McCall's article, but if you could talk a little bit about the implications of dialectical realism for feminist theorizing, for maybe sociological research, in the sort of hermeneutic, did you call it pluritopic hermeneutics, the sort of example that you gave? If you could talk a little bit more about some of the implications of that.
Yeah, well, pluritopic hermeneutics is a term that Walter Mignolo came up with, and he's a semiotician from Argentina. He teaches at Duke, and he's one of the coloniality scholars, part of the coloniality research group. But basically what he does is he extends Gadamer's hermeneutics, his notion of horizon, and he extends it, and he also critiques it. And what he says is that the West, since the Renaissance, has gone hand in hand with colonialism and imperial expansion. And that doesn't just entail the colonization of people, but also the colonization of their hermeneutical and explanatory toolkits. And so to remedy what he calls that the coloniality of power, knowledge, power/knowledge, you need to kind of locate the knower outside of the Eurocenter and in the periphery. And that's where the interactive knowledge and conversation about knowledge has to begin, in order to kind of unpack what he calls different worlds of sense. So that's what, he calls, he would call Gadamer's notion of the interpretive horizon monotopic, right? And then he's looking for more of a ditopic or a pluritopic hermeneutics, all right? So that's also become part of the repository of the future of minority studies. The question is, how do you do this? Right? Even with what I would consider to be fairly straightforward ways of adjudicating truth claims, like in standpoint theory among feminists, became very complicated, right? And then you can go much further to much more complicated scenarios, right? Like where you have radical alterity, right? When you're studying people that are very, right, from completely different cultures, right? And so I want to just give an example in terms of both of these scenarios. So in terms of standpoint, which is was a debate that went on, you know, largely within feminist thought, I think that there's an epistemology that has been really helpful for me to think about these power differentials, right, within feminist movement and around race, and as sophisticated as I think we've become in terms of understanding how race operates, we have so much further to go, right? And so Charles Mills, who developed this epistemology of ignorance, he's in the subdiscipline of the philosophy of race, and basically what he argues is that the social cognition of whites is distorted, right, because of past race relations, and we've developed a sort of collective amnesia around race relations, and we've developed it maybe unconsciously, but still very actively. And so that ignorance isn't something that just happens or that we're just passive about. It's something that we're constantly, even though in an unacknowledged way, working at disremembering. And so because we're actively disremembering, when we hear people of color testify about their experiences, it feels threatening to us, right? And so we react in a hostile way. That explains, I mean, you know, I know it's obvious and everything, but it just bears repetition when you ask, well, why would that debate even happen? When it, you know, standpoint to me seems to be pretty clear that you're getting a perspective that you would otherwise not have because of your embodied location, right? And so, but if you think of this as a part of being in an embodied location of being white means active disremembering, right? Then it almost seems like our theory is only going to take us so far. There is a way in which we have to be actively doing something else. So I think also wedding theories to one another, wedding standpoint to epistemologies of ignorance or to pluritopic hermeneutics and other post-colonial theories, we start to buttress up, right, and gain and maintain a certain amount of clarity, right, about what it is we're doing. So, then it gets more complicated, right? Because let's say I'm thinking of some work that's being done, which I think is pretty exciting work in the field of anthropology. Martin Holbrod has done some work with oracular diviners in Cuba. And in his work, he talks about these a diviner that and everybody that lives in the community of this diviner that says that when he says you're bewitched, it's a fact, right? And so he was like, okay, well, how is this going to be a fact? In my world, this isn't a fact, right? In my world, there are very few things that could be considered facts, like propositions, you know, like a bachelor is an unmarried man, that sort of thing. We have very few statements where our statements somehow are going to correlate absolutely with the, with what's represented to turn it into a fact. So Holbrod says, well, what kind of a world would this be in which this could be a fact, right? That you are bewitched. And what he comes up with is that truth means something differently, right? In that culture, what it means is that it also means a future act. It includes the statement that you're making. So when you say you are bewitched, you're actually altering the constitution of that person, right? And the actual act of naming it alters you and alters bewitched such that it becomes true, and it is true. So once you have that, right, then what do? Right? Oh, so the people over there in that culture, that's what they believe truth is, right? Well, we don't. So then how do you kind of adjudicate that? And that's where it is complicated, but I do think that it requires a great amount of self-reflexivity, right? Otherwise, why would you be doing that work? So it kind of makes you think, well, does that actually happen here in our own culture? Is it true that I also, when I speak and make statements that are facts, I'm also altering the truth when I'm saying it, or at least making more visible certain truths? Like, even if you think of, like, you know, Chandra Talpady Mohanty's statement, well, no, I'm gonna retain the concept third world worker to conscientize these women that don't understand themselves as workers, right? Can she alter the reality of their consciousness in that moment by retaining that category? So I don't know. I mean, it's the most important element is that we don't keep separate. It doesn't seem like that would be the reason why we engage difference of any kind, whether it's radical or less radical, but rather to at a very deep level take seriously what the difference is through self-reflexivity.
Yeah, those are such great examples, and I think provocative for critical realism as well, and sort of suggests, right? I think that there's some danger in having sort of meta-theoretical grounds for adjudicating knowledge claims, but that they may need to be situated and contextual, et cetera. So yeah, that's such a helpful answer. Thank you.
I think we need to be more conservative, I guess, would be ultimately what which is kind of, I think, your question, where you started from. I think that we need we need to be more, conservative in the sense of just very limited, right, in what we can make as a claim of truth or objectivity, rather than something that's going to be perennial, timeless, or that's going to work universally for all time, for all space, or even for large swaths of space, right? Just much more conservative type claims, and be willing to give up, right? Something that we've developed maybe over time as a concept, give it up and move on to something else.
Yeah, that's a great directive for researchers and theorists alike. I think that kind of humility about social objects, especially. I think we're sort of running out of time, so I wanted to give you a chance to just make any final remarks you might want to make. Otherwise, I'll remind the audience of where they can find this webinar.
No, I think I'm good. Thank you so much for having me here today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Laura. This has been such a lovely discussion, and I'm so grateful to you for sharing your amazing work with us. Again, just as a reminder, this webinar has been recorded and can be found on the Critical Realist Network website. And there you'll also find a blog, a critical realism blog, as well as a resource library with a lot of this literature we've been discussing today. Also, we want to remind you that we have upcoming webinars. Our next one is with Doug Porpora on Truth and Democracy in the Age of Trump on May 2nd. So we hope that you've enjoyed this discussion and that you'll join us for future discussions.